Clara Ashworth slammed the ledger open on Douglas Hale's mahogany desk so hard the inkwell jumped. Her father had been dead 11 days. His signature on the document in front of her was dated the morning he died, the same morning the doctor said Edmund Ashworth could not lift his own hand to drink water. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. "This signature is a forgery," she said, loud enough for every man in that bank to hear. "And I can prove it." If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe right now and follow Clara's fight all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning her father died, Clara Ashworth sat beside his bed and held his hand until it went cold, and she did not cry. She had learned early that tears cost time she could not afford. Edmund Ashworth had taught her that. He had also taught her double-entry bookkeeping, the difference between a legitimate land transfer and a fraudulent one, and how to read a contract the way a doctor reads a wound, looking not at the surface, but at what was hidden underneath. She was 19 years old, and she was alone, and she had exactly $37 in the strongbox under her father's desk. Redstone Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1883, was not a town that had patience for grief. The silver had been played out 2 years prior, but gold had taken its place, and the prospectors and speculators and railroad men who flooded in behind it had rebuilt the town in their own image, loud, hungry, and entirely certain that anything worth having was worth taking. The main street ran half a mile between two ridgelines, and every building on it seemed to lean slightly forward, like a man straining toward something just out of reach. Clara arranged her father's funeral herself. Warren Ashworth, her father's younger brother and her legal guardian, until she turned 21, arrived 2 days after the burial with a leather satchel full of papers and the practiced expression of a man who had rehearsed his sympathy in a mirror. "You look tired, Clara," he said, settling into the chair across from her father's desk as though it already belonged to him. "This has all been a terrible shock." "I'm fine, Uncle Warren." She kept her eyes on the ledger open in front of her. "Father left the accounts in good order. The office can stay operational." "About that." Warren set his satchel on the corner of the desk. "I've been in conversation with Douglas Hale at the Land Trust. Given your situation, a young woman alone, no business experience to speak of. I have 6 years of experience. Father taught me everything he knew." Warren smiled the way men smile when they have already decided not to listen. "Bookkeeping lessons aren't the same as running a professional office, sweetheart. Hale has offered a very generous arrangement. The trust would absorb your father's client contracts and take over the building lease. You'd receive a settlement enough to get yourself to San Francisco, start fresh somewhere civilized." Clara closed the ledger slowly. "Father's clients are under contract through the end of the year. Those contracts transfer to me, not to Hale's trust." "Well, technically." "There's no technically about it, Uncle Warren. It's written in the agreements. I have copies of every one." The smile stayed on Warren's face, but something behind his eyes shifted. "I'll give you a few days to think it over. Grief affects our judgment. You'll see reason once you've had time to rest." He left without pressing further, and Clara watched him go through the front window, watched him cross the street directly to Hale's bank without stopping anywhere else, and she understood then that her uncle had not come to comfort her. He had come to measure what was left. She spent the next 4 days doing nothing but reading. Her father had been meticulous. Every client contract, every survey record, every land transfer he had notarized or witnessed over 3 years in Redstone Creek was filed in order by date, cross-referenced by parcel number, stored in a fireproof cabinet that had belonged to his own father before him. Clara read everything twice. On the morning of the 5th day, she found the first discrepancy. A land transfer dated March 1882. The Bellamy family owners of the Copper Ridge claim. According to the county registry, they had voluntarily sold their mining rights to Redstone Creek Land and Trust for $400. According to her father's original contract and survey record, that same claim had been assessed at $11,000 6 months prior. There was no note from her father explaining the discrepancy, Edmund Ashworth noted everything. He had not noted this. Clara pulled the adjacent files. The Kowalski claim, the Ferris family homestead, old Pete Dunbar's water rights. Each one the same pattern. Voluntary transfer recorded price far below assessed value. No notation from her father explaining why the owners would agree to such terms. 15 separate transactions in 14 months. She was still at her father's desk at midnight when she heard the front door of the office open. She stood up fast-hand, going to the drawer where her father kept his pistol, and found herself looking at a man she had never seen before. He was lean and dark-eyed, still wearing road dust on his coat, and the careful stillness of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where he was not expected. He stopped when he saw her, assessed her in 2 seconds, with the kind of look that took stock without being disrespectful, and touched the brim of his hat. "Beg your pardon, miss. Door wasn't locked. I'm looking for Edmund Ashworth." "My father is dead." The words still felt strange in her mouth. "I'm Clara Ashworth. Who are you?" "Cole Maddox." He didn't offer his hand, which she noted. "I'm sorry for your loss. When did he pass?" 11 days ago. The doctor called it heart failure." She watched his face. "Why were you looking for him?" Cole Maddox crossed to the desk without being invited, which under any other circumstance would have been presumptuous enough to earn him the door. But he moved like a man following a thread, his attention already on the papers spread across her father's desk. Because 3 weeks ago, Edmund Ashworth sent a letter to a private inquiry office in Carson City saying he had evidence of systematic land fraud being conducted through Redstone Creek Land and Trust, and that he feared for his safety. He looked up at her. "I'm from that office." The silence in the room had weight. "Show me," Clara said. He produced the letter from his coat. Her father's handwriting. Her father's seal. Clara read it twice and set it down with a steadiness she had to consciously maintain. "He never told me." "He may have been trying to protect you." "He should have told me." The steadiness cracked slightly at the edges. She pulled it back. "I've been sitting here since midnight going through his files. I've found 15 transactions that don't add up. Assessed values and transfer prices that are nowhere near each other. No explanatory notes from my father, and every one of them transferred to Hale's trust." Cole looked at her with an expression that was not quite skepticism and not quite surprise. It was the look of a man recalibrating. "You found 15 in one night. I know his system. I know what should be there and what isn't." She turned the file toward him. "Look at the Bellamy transfer. March of last year. Father assessed Copper Ridge at $11,000. 6 months later it transferred for $400. There's no notation anywhere explaining why the Bellamys would agree to that." Cole leaned over the file. He read carefully. "Where are the Bellamys now?" "I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone yet." She paused. "You said my father feared for his safety. Do you think his death was—" "I think the timing is worth examining." He said it plainly, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. "I think a man who sends a letter saying he fears for his safety and then dies 11 days before the investigator arrives is worth examining very carefully." Clara sat back down. The magnitude of it was trying to press in on her from all sides, and she would not let it. Not yet. "Douglas Hale came to my father's funeral. He stood at the graveside and shook my hand and told me Edmund was one of the finest men he'd ever known. Men like Hale are very good at that. My uncle Warren works for him. I didn't know that until 2 days ago." She looked at the ledger. "Warren came here the day after I arrived and tried to get me to sell father's client contracts to the trust and leave town. Did you agree?" "I told him the contracts transferred to me by law." Something shifted in Cole Maddox's expression. Not admiration, exactly, more like the moment a man realizes a problem he thought was simple is considerably more complex than he assumed, and that the complexity is not unwelcome. "Miss Ashworth, how much do you actually know about these files?" "More than anyone in this town expects me to." She met his eyes directly. "My father taught me his entire system from the time I was 13. I can read a land survey the same way I can read a sentence. I understand double-entry accounting contract law as it applies to property transfer in the state of Nevada and the specific notarization requirements that Hale's trust has been violating in at least 9 of these 15 transactions. She let that settle. What I don't have is someone who can move through this town without being Edmund Ashworth's daughter. Someone who can talk to the claim owners and find out what actually happened at those transfers. Cole was quiet for a moment. You're proposing we work together. I'm proposing that you have access to the people I need information from, and I have access to the documents that make that information mean something. She closed the file. My father died 11 days ago, and I have $37 to my name, and my uncle is trying to sell my father's life's work to the man who may have had him killed. I don't have the luxury of waiting for a better offer. Cole Maddox looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was measuring, he finished measuring it. All right, he said. Show me the other 14. They worked through the night. Cole Maddox, Clara discovered, was methodical in a way that was different from her father's meticulousness, but complementary to it. Where Edmund Ashworth had cataloged everything in careful sequence, Cole tracked patterns. He could look at 6 separate transactions and identify the single procedural irregularity that connected them all. He asked sharp questions and listened to the answers without interrupting, which was rarer than she had ever realized before this night. She discovered that he had been a deputy sheriff in Elko County until 2 years ago, when he refused to sign paperwork clearing a railroad land acquisition that had displaced 4 Shoshone families without compensation. The sheriff had signed it anyway. Cole had turned in his badge the same afternoon. He had been working independently since then, taking cases that involved what he called institutional dishonesty, the kind of wrong that wore a legal suit and shook your hand at funerals. Hale's been doing this for at least 14 months, Cole said around 3 in the morning when they had the 15 transactions laid out in chronological order across the desk. Possibly longer. These are just the ones your father documented. The pattern is consistent. Clara traced a finger down the list. Every transfer happens within 6 weeks of a loan being issued by Hale's bank to the claim owner. The loan amount is always just large enough to create a payment obligation the owner can't meet by harvest season. Then comes the default notice, then the transfer recorded as voluntary. Voluntary. Cole's voice was flat. That's the word that keeps appearing in the registry records. Voluntary conveyance. Which means no one can challenge it without proving coercion. And proving coercion means the former owners have to testify against the most powerful man in Redstone Creek. She paused. But there's something Hale didn't account for. The notarization records. 9 of these 15 transfers show notarization stamps from my father's office. But the corresponding entries in his notarization log don't exist. He never logged them. Cole was very still. Someone forged his seal. Someone used his seal without logging the transaction. My father logged every single notarization he performed without exception for 12 years. These 9 entries exist in the county registry, but not in his own records. She looked at Cole directly. Which means either my father was complicit in the fraud, or someone had access to his seal without his knowledge. And you don't believe he was complicit. My father sent you a letter 3 weeks ago saying he had evidence and feared for his life. Her voice remained level. No, I don't believe he was complicit. Then someone had access to this office. Cole looked around the room with new attention. And 9 fraudulent notarizations in the county registry means Hale has already corrupted the legal record. We can't go to the county clerk with this. If Hale owns the clerk, we don't go to the county clerk. Clara pulled a different file from the cabinet, this one thicker than the others. We go to the Nevada State Land Office in Carson City. Their registry is independent of the county system. My father kept copies of all his original surveys and contracts, which means I have the pre-fraud baseline. If I can present the original assessments alongside the transfer records, the discrepancy becomes visible at the state level, where Hale has no influence. Cole stared at her. How long would that take to compile? The filing deadline for the Hendricks claim dispute, that's the most recent one the family is still fighting, it is 22 days from today. If I can get the documentation to Carson City before that deadline, the state office has grounds to freeze all 15 transfers pending investigation. She set the file down. 22 days. That's what we have. Hale will know what you're doing the moment you start asking questions. I know. He had your father killed Miss Ashworth. I know that too. She did not look away from him. Are you trying to talk me out of this? Cole Maddox was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then, no. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're walking into. My father understood it, and he walked in anyway. He just didn't tell me in time to help him. Something in her chest had been locked down tight since the morning Edmund Ashworth stopped breathing, and she kept it locked down now because there would be time for it later when this was finished. I'm helping him now. That's all this is. The sun was beginning to lighten the windows when Cole finally leaned back from the desk and looked at the organized array of files that Clara had built over the course of the night. 15 cases, 47 supporting documents, 9 fraudulent notarizations, 3 witnesses they needed to locate the former owners of the Bellamy, Kowalski, and Ferris claims, all of whom had left Redstone Creek after their transfers and might have done so under duress. I'll find the Bellamys, Cole said. I know a man in Winnemucca who might know where they went. He looked at Clara. You need to be careful with those files. If Warren knows you've been going through them, Warren comes to check on me every other day. I'll keep the sensitive documents separate from the main cabinet. She began to reorganize the desk with the swift efficiency of long practice. And I need you to tell me something honestly, Mr. Maddox. If I can. My father's letter to your office, it said he had evidence, but the letter arrived and he was already dead. Do you think he sent it because he knew something was about to happen to him? Cole was quiet for a moment too long. Yes, he said finally. I think he knew. Clara nodded once and filed the last document. Then he trusted someone to come. Someone did come. She looked at Cole Maddox across her father's desk in the early morning light, and the thing locked in her chest pressed outward, and she held it firm. Let's not waste what he bought us. Cole touched the brim of his hat, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a handshake. He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. Miss Ashworth, for what it's worth, what you did tonight, going through those files, finding the notarization discrepancy. Your father trained you well. Yes, Clara said. He did. Cole left. Clara heard his boots on the boardwalk outside moving north toward the livery stable, and she turned back to the desk and sat down in her father's chair and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to put her face in her hands. Not to cry, just to feel the full weight of it, the loss of him, the scale of what had been done, the magnitude of what she was about to try. Then she lifted her head, opened the notarization log to the first missing entry, and began to build her case. Across the street in the window of the bank that bore his name, Douglas Hale stood watching the light burning in Edmund Ashworth's office, and felt for the first time in 14 months of clean, profitable operation, the faint and irritating sensation of something beginning to go wrong. The girl had been here almost 2 weeks. She should have taken Warren's offer. She should have left. The fact that she hadn't was a minor inconvenience, nothing more. He turned from the window and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on his credenza. He was not yet concerned. He would be. Cole Maddox came back the next morning with mud on his boots and a name written on a folded piece of paper that he set on Clara's desk without ceremony. She unfolded it. Thomas Bellamy. Last known address, a boarding house in Winnemucca, 60 miles east. Working a day labor job at a feed supply warehouse. His wife and 2 daughters were with him. He left Redstone Creek in April of last year, Cole said, pulling the chair across from her and sitting down without being invited, which she had already decided she would not bother correcting. My contact in Winnemucca saw him about 3 weeks ago. Says Bellamy doesn't talk about the claim. Gets quiet when anyone asks. Cole paused. That's the kind of quiet that comes from being told to stay that way. Threatened, Clara said. Most likely. Which means getting him to testify is going to take more than a kind letter. Cole leaned forward, forearms on the desk. I need to go to Winnemucca. Talk to him in person. But that takes 2 days minimum round trip, which means 2 days you're here alone with those files. I'm always alone with these files. Hale doesn't know what you have yet, but he's watching this office. I've seen his man, heavy-set fellow brown coat, positioned across the street 2 mornings running. He held her gaze. If Warren reports back to Hale that you're not taking the settlement offer, the watching stops and something else starts. Clara absorbed that without flinching. Then you need to go to Winnemucca before Warren comes back and figures out I've been in the restricted files. She pulled a sealed envelope from the desk and handed it to him. Give this to Thomas Bellamy. Read it first if you want. I want him to know who I am and why I'm asking. I want him to know my father is dead. Cole took the envelope and turned it over in his hands without opening it. You think that'll matter to him? My father assessed his claim honestly. He told the Bellamys what it was worth. If someone later used my father's seal to make that transfer look legitimate, Thomas Bellamy deserves to know Edmund. Ashworth didn't betray him. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Cole recognized. Not grief exactly, more like the particular fury of someone who has been robbed of something they cannot replace. Yes, I think it'll matter. Cole put the envelope in his coat. He was at the door when Clara said, "Be careful who sees you leave." He glanced back. I'm always careful, Miss Ashworth. My father was careful too. She was already back at the ledger when she said it, not looking up, and Cole stepped out into the morning street and stood for a moment in the sun, feeling the weight of that sentence settle across his shoulders. The man in the brown coat was across the street pretending to examine a bolt of fabric outside the dry goods store. Cole walked north without looking at him. Warren Ashworth arrived at the office at 10:30 that morning, earlier than usual, wearing his courthouse expression and carrying a new leather satchel that was slightly thicker than the one from his previous visit. Clara had the client ledger open on the desk and her own notebook positioned beside it. Nothing in view that wouldn't be there on any ordinary working morning. You're keeping busy, Warren said, studying the desk with eyes that were trying to read everything at once, while appearing to read nothing. Father's quarterly reports are due at the end of the month. His clients still need servicing. Clara did not look up. Sit down, Uncle Warren. You came to ask me something. He sat. He arranged the satchel on his knee and opened it with the practiced ease of a man presenting a gift. Douglas has revised his offer considerably. He set a document on the desk. $1,200 for the client contract's clear title release on the office lease and a letter of professional reference from the trust for any accounting position you might seek in San Francisco or Sacramento. $1,200 was more money than Clara had seen in a single transaction in her entire life. She did not let that register on her face. She looked at the document for exactly the amount of time it would take someone to be tempted, and then she pushed it back across the desk. The contracts aren't mine to sell. Warren's patience thinned slightly at the edges. Clara. They're not mine to sell because they belong to the clients. My father structured his agreements so that the notarial and accounting services transfer to his designated successor in the event of his death. That successor is me by his own written designation. She turned the ledger toward her uncle and pointed to the relevant entry. It's in his operating charter filed with the county clerk in 1879. I found it 2 days ago. Warren looked at the entry. He looked at it for a long time. When he raised his eyes to hers, the sympathy was gone, and what remained was something considerably more honest. You've been thorough. Father raised me to be thorough. He also raised you to be practical. Warren leaned forward. What you're describing, continuing to operate this office, managing these accounts on your own, it isn't realistic, sweetheart. You're 19 years old. The men who hold these contracts are not going to bring their business to a girl who, 3 of them already have, Clara turned to the page in her appointment book. Mr. Fenwick came in yesterday morning. Mr. Aldridge sent his foreman with documents to be notarized. And Mrs. Dunbar, Pete Dunbar's widow, came in person to ask whether I could help her understand some transfer paperwork she received from the trust last month. She closed the book. Mrs. Dunbar was very confused about why she had supposedly agreed to transfer her late husband's water rights to Redstone Creek Land and Trust for $40 when she had no memory of signing anything. The room was very quiet. Warren set the satchel on the floor beside his chair. It was a small movement, but it was a retreat, and they both knew it. That's a matter between Mrs. Dunbar and the Trust's legal department. It has nothing to do with Edmund's client accounts. I agree completely, Clara said pleasantly. I told her I would look into it as a courtesy. Nothing more. She folded her hands on the desk. Tell Mr. Hale thank you for the revised offer. I'll give it serious consideration. Warren left faster than he had arrived. Clara watched him cross the street, watched him pass the bank entirely, watched him continue to the telegraph office at the far end of the block, and she understood that whatever patience Douglas Hale had been extending to Edmund Ashworth's daughter had just run its course. She had perhaps 48 hours before the situation changed in character. She spent those hours building the state, filing with the methodical focus her father had taught her. Not rushing, not panicking, because panic made errors, and errors were the only weapon Hale could use against her in a legal proceeding. She organized the original survey records chronologically, cross-referenced them against the fraudulent transfer documents, and prepared a separate exhibit documenting the 9 missing notarization log entries with their corresponding forged registry stamps. She worked from her father's system, but improved it where she could, adding a summary index that any state land office clerk could follow without legal expertise. On the second evening, Ruth Hennessy knocked on the office door at 7 o'clock with a plate of food and an expression that meant she intended to stay until she was satisfied Clara had eaten all of it. Ruth was 54 years old and had run the boarding house on Clement Street since her husband died of a mine collapse 8 years prior. She had known Edmund Ashworth since his first week in Redstone Creek, and she was one of 3 people in town whose opinion Clara had already decided to trust entirely, based on nothing more than the particular directness of her eyes. You haven't left this building in 2 days, Ruth said, setting the plate on the corner of the desk that was not covered in documents. Mabel at the dry goods store says there's been a man watching your front window since Tuesday. I know about him. Do you know that Warren Ashworth had dinner at Hale's house last night? Private dinner, no other guests. Ruth sat down in the client chair without asking which Clara appreciated. I have a girl who cleans for the Hales 3 mornings a week. She has very good ears. Clara looked up from the documents. What did she hear? She heard Hale tell Warren that the situation needed to be resolved before the end of the month. She heard Warren say the girl was more trouble than expected, but that there were other ways to handle it. Ruth's voice was entirely flat when she delivered this. I thought you should know. Other ways to handle it. Clara looked at the fireproof cabinet at 12 years of her father's careful work at the exhibit she had been building for 2 days, and she felt something cold and clarifying move through her. Ruth, do you know anyone in this town who would store some documents for me? Somewhere they wouldn't be looked for. My own strongbox, Ruth said immediately. It's under the floorboards in my private room. Nobody knows it's there except me, and now you. She paused. Are those the documents I think they are? They're copies. Certified copies I've made this week. If anything happens to the originals, give them to me tonight. Ruth stood up and picked up the empty plate Clara had eaten without noticing which she suspected was Ruth's intention. And stop working for 2 hours. You look like your father did the last month before he died, and I mean that as a warning, not a compliment. Clara set down her pen. He knew, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. He knew what was happening and he didn't tell me and he's dead and I don't know if I'm angry at him or just... She stopped. The thing in her chest was pressing again and she had been holding it back for 2 weeks, And in this moment in the evening quiet with Ruth Hennessy standing across from her with a plain expression that held no pity and no performative comfort, just steadiness, she could not quite hold it anymore. She didn't cry. It wasn't that kind of release. It was more like something cracking open and then closing again, slightly reshaped. "He should have told me." "Yes," Ruth said. "He should have." She didn't soften it or explain it away. Edmund was a man who protected the people he loved by carrying things alone. It was his best quality and his worst one, and I told him so more than once. She moved toward the door. "Bring me the copies when you're ready, and get some sleep, Clara. You can't fight this war if you collapse before it starts." Cole came back from Winnemucca on the morning of the third day. He came in through the back door, which Clara had left unlocked after Ruth told her about the man in the brown coat, and he sat down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Bellamy talked," he said. Clara set down her pen. "Tell me." "Your letter did it." He read it twice, didn't say anything. Then he told his wife to take the girls to the other room, and he talked for 2 hours. Cole pulled out his notebook. He never wanted to sell. His wife never wanted to sell. The loan came from Hale's bank in February of last year, $300 to cover equipment after their sluice box was sabotaged. Bellamy suspects the sabotage was deliberate, but can't prove it. The loan terms looked reasonable. Then 6 weeks later, he gets a default notice, citing a clause buried in paragraph 14 of the agreement, a clause his wife read aloud to me from memory. Because she was so angry, she had it memorized. It said that any damage to primary extraction equipment constituted grounds for accelerated repayment. Accelerated repayment he couldn't meet. In 30 days, he went to Hale personally. Hale was sympathetic. Very sorry, offered him an alternative, sign the transfer for $400, and the debt would be cleared, no further action. Bellamy asked for time to find a lawyer. Hale's man came to his house that night. Cole paused. Bellamy showed me a scar on his forearm. Clara was very still. His wife and daughters were home, Cole said. He signed the next morning. The office was quiet enough that Clara could hear the street outside, the ordinary sounds of a town conducting its ordinary business over the top of something rotten running underneath it. She looked at her exhibit file at the column of names, Bellamy, Kowalski, Ferris, Dunbar, 11 others, and she thought about 14 families who had lost what they built, and a banker standing at a graveside shaking her hand. "Will he testify?" she asked. "He said he won't come back to Redstone Creek. He's too afraid." Cole met her eyes. "But he'll give a sworn affidavit to a state investigator. He'll sign a notarized statement. If we can get a state proceeding started, he'll participate in that process." "That's enough." Clara turned to the exhibit. "I have the documentation ready for Carson City. 9 fraudulent notarizations, 15 below-value transfers, the original survey records establishing real assessed values, and now a direct witness account of coercion." She pulled the summary index from the top of the stack. "If I file this with the State Land Office before the Hendricks deadline, Hale will know you're filing the moment you leave this building with those documents." Cole said it without drama, which made it heavier. "He's had that man watching your door for 4 days. You can't ride to Carson City alone." "I wasn't planning to go alone." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, just the recalibration she was beginning to recognize as the way Cole Maddox adjusted to new information. "I'll go with you." "I need you to do something else." She slid a second document across the desk. "I need you to find Kowalski and get a second affidavit before we leave. 1 witness is a claim. 2 witnesses is a pattern. The State Land Office will move faster with 2. She watched him read the address she had tracked down through 3 cross-references in the county employment records. "He's working a claim outside of Battle Mountain, closer than Winnemucca. You could be there and back before I finish the final copies." Cole looked at the address, then at the exhibit stack, then at Clara. "You've been busy." "I've had 2 days," she said. "My father raised me to be thorough." He left, within the hour. Clara finished the exhibit copies and wrapped them in oilcloth and walked to Ruth's boarding house in the midday crowd, moving like a woman running an ordinary errand, the package under her arm, unremarkable against the general traffic of the street. She gave the copies to Ruth without ceremony and walked back to the office and sat down and looked at the original documents spread across her father's desk. 19 days until the Hendricks filing deadline. She had a former deputy-turned-investigator who believed her a terrified witness, willing to sign a statement and documentation that she was increasingly certain was enough to initiate a state investigation. She also had an uncle who had sold her father's trust to the man who likely had him killed, a hired watcher stationed outside her door, and the growing awareness that the window of time in which Douglas Hale would tolerate the inconvenience of Edmund Ashworth's daughter was narrowing faster than she had initially calculated. She pulled her father's photograph from the desk drawer and set it in front of her, something she had not allowed herself to do until now. Edmund Ashworth, 61 years old, precise and patient, and entirely convinced that careful records properly maintained were a more powerful weapon than any gun. He had been right about that. He had been right about nearly everything. He had only been wrong about what they would do to him when they realized it. "I found the notarizations, Papa," she said quietly to the photograph, to the fireproof cabinet, to the 12 years of careful work still waiting to be used. "I know what they did. I know how they did it." She put the photograph back in the drawer and picked up her pen. "Now I'm going to show everyone else." Outside, the man in the brown coat shifted his weight from one foot to the other and kept watching the window where the lamp burned steady in the early afternoon. And he did not know, because no one had thought to warn him, because no one in Douglas Hale's careful organization had considered it a possibility worth preparing for, that the girl inside was not waiting for rescue. She was not waiting for anything at all. She was already 3 steps ahead, building the case that would dismantle everything they had spent 14 months constructing, one precise and documented number at a time. Cole came back from Battle Mountain on the evening of the second day with a broken lip and Jan Kowalski's signed affidavit folded inside his coat. Clara looked at his face when he came through the back door and said nothing about the lip. She took the affidavit and read it standing up, and when she finished reading, she set it on the desk beside Bellamy's statement and pressed her palm flat against both pages for a moment, like she was making sure they were real. "Same pattern?" she asked. "Near identical." Cole pulled the chair out and sat down heavily. "Loan in January, equipment failure in February, default notice in March, transfer in April. Kowalski's sluice box didn't malfunction. Someone cut the main support brace. He found the cut marks himself, but by the time he tried to show anyone, the equipment had already been removed from the claim." He paused. The man who came to his house wasn't one of Hale's regular employees. Kowalski described him big red-haired scar across the left jaw. Wore no badge and gave no name. The same man who went to Bellamy. Bellamy described a big man with red hair. Cole met her eyes. Hale has someone he uses for this specific purpose. Not a deputy, not anyone connected to the bank officially. Someone he brings in from outside when the situation requires a different kind of persuasion. Clara thought about her father alone in this office, realizing what he had found writing a letter to a private inquiry office 60 miles away because he had nowhere closer to turn. She thought about whether that same red-haired man with the scar had come to this office after hours, whether her father had heard someone at the door late one evening the way she had heard Cole 2 weeks ago, and whether the difference between their two situations was that her father had been alone. "Is Kowalski willing to submit the affidavit to the state land office?" "He is," he said. Cole stopped, and something in his expression shifted in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked briefly like a man carrying something heavier than an assignment. "He said your father came to see him after the transfer, came out to Battle Mountain personally to tell him he was sorry. Said he hadn't known what the transfer document would be used for when he..." Cole paused again. "When someone used his seal to notarize it." Clara sat down. "He knew," she said. It wasn't a question. Kowalski thinks your father figured it out sometime in early fall. That's consistent with the letter he sent to my office in October. Cole leaned forward. He didn't go to the sheriff because the sheriff is Hale's man. He didn't go to the county clerk because the clerk processes the trust's paperwork and he couldn't know who else was involved. He came to Kowalski to apologize personally and told him he was gathering evidence to take to the state level. And 2 months later he was dead. Clara's voice was entirely level, and she hated that it was because the levelness meant she was past the point of the thing cracking open and into something colder and more sustainable. She had her father's capacity for that apparently. She had never been grateful for it before. Kowalski needs to know we're filing in 17 days. If the state office accepts the complaint and initiates review, he'll need to be reachable. He knows. He gave me an address in Battle Mountain where a letter will find him. Good. She stood back up and returned to the exhibit. I need 2 more days to finish the index. Then we ride for Carson City. Cole was looking at her in the particular way he had developed over the past week, not with concern exactly, more with the focused attention of someone who has stopped being surprised by a situation and started being genuinely interested in how it resolves. There's something else. Tell me. The man in the brown coat is gone. Clara turned around. Since when? I noticed when I came up the back street. He's been there every morning for 6 days. Tonight he's not. Cole's tone was careful and even. That's not reassurance, Miss Ashworth. That means Hale stopped watching and started deciding. The knock at the front door came at 8 o'clock the following morning, before Clara had lit the second lamp. Not a customer knock. 3 sharp raps with the authority of someone who expected the door to open immediately. She recognized the pattern. She had heard it at her uncle's courthouse twice when she was 14 years old. She opened the door. Warren Ashworth stood on the boardwalk with 2 men behind him. She did not know either man. They were not local. She had learned every face in Redstone Creek in the 2 weeks she had been here, the way her father had taught her to do in any new place, because people were information, and information was the only reliable protection. These 2 were strangers, and they had the particular stillness of men who were being paid to be patient. Clara. Warren stepped inside without being invited. The 2 men stayed on the boardwalk. We need to have a serious conversation. We've been having serious conversations for 2 weeks. She left the door open, which was a deliberate choice. Open doors meant witnesses, and Main Street was already moving with morning traffic. Sit down, Uncle Warren. He sat. He looked at her with the sympathy entirely gone, now replaced by something she recognized as its truest form, the expression of a man who has decided that kindness has served its purpose and it is time to be direct. Douglas has been very patient with you, more patient than most men in his position would be. But you've been asking questions around town. You went to see Ruth Hennessy twice this week. You need to understand what you're doing. I've been servicing my father's client accounts, Clara said. That's what I'm here to do. You've been building a case. Warren said it flatly. Don't insult either of us by pretending otherwise. Douglas knows about the Kowalski visit. He knows a man named Maddox has been making inquiries in Winnemucca. He leaned forward. Clara, listen to me carefully because I am telling you this as your family and not as Douglas's associate. What you think you found in those files, whatever your father told you, whatever conclusions you've drawn, you need to let it go. Take the settlement. Leave Redstone Creek. This is not a situation you can win. Is that a warning from my uncle or a threat from Mr. Hale? Warren's jaw tightened. It's a fact. You're 19 years old, and you're alone, and you have no idea what these men are capable of. He stood up and put his hands flat on the desk and leaned toward her in a way that was designed to make the room feel smaller. I helped raise you, Clara. After your mother died, I was there. Do you remember that I am trying to protect you? You protected yourself, she said quietly. You made an arrangement that keeps you safe and comfortable, and you came here to make sure I don't destroy it. She held his gaze without moving backward. You knew my father had discovered the fraud. You knew what was going to happen to him, and you said nothing." The room went very quiet. Warren straightened up. He put his hat back on with the deliberate care of a man reconstructing his composure piece by piece. "Take the settlement, Clara. I won't be able to ask Douglas to extend this offer again." "I know." He walked out. The two men on the boardwalk fell in on either side of him, and the three of them moved up the street together, and Clara stood at the open door and watched them go and let herself feel the full reality of what her uncle had just confirmed, not by anything he said, but by the fact that he had not denied a single word of it. She closed the door and turned to find Cole standing in the doorway to the back room, where he had been since 7 that morning, going over the exhibit index. He had heard everything. "How long before he comes back?" she asked. "Not him. Someone else." Cole crossed to the window without touching the curtain. "The two men with him, I've seen the type before. They're not from Hale's bank, and they're not local muscle. They were hired somewhere else, and they're being paid to wait." He turned from the window. "We can't wait 2 more days, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. Neither of them acknowledged it. "The index isn't finished," she said. "How much is left?" 4 transfers. The cross-reference tables for the notarization exhibits." "How long?" She looked at the desk. She looked at the exhibit stack and calculated honestly the way her father had taught her without wishful thinking. 6 hours if I don't stop." "Then don't stop." Cole moved toward the back door. "I'm going to arrange horses and a second route out of town. Don't answer the door for anyone until I come back. Anyone." He paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Ruth Hennessy has the copies, locked in her strongbox." "Good. If something happens to the originals—" "Nothing is going to happen to the originals," Clara said. 6 hours, Mr. Maddox." He left. She sat down and picked up her pen and did not stop. She was 3 hours in when she heard the back door open and knew before she looked up that it was not Cole. The footstep pattern was wrong, heavier, less deliberate, the sound of a man who was not accustomed to moving quietly and had not bothered to try. The man who stepped into the office was large and red-haired with a scar across his left jaw, and Clara understood with a cold clarity that arrived faster than fear that she had perhaps 6 seconds before the situation became unrecoverable. She stood up and reached for the desk drawer, and had her father's pistol in her hand before he covered half the distance between them. She did not point it at him. She held it at her side with her finger beside the trigger guard, and said in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "This is a business office on the main street of Redstone Creek. It is 8 o'clock in the morning and there are 20 people within earshot of this window." The red-haired man stopped. He assessed the pistol with the eyes of someone who had been in this particular calculation before and was working out the odds. He was large enough and fast enough that the odds were not straightforwardly in Clara's favor, and they both knew it. But 20 people within earshot was a different variable. "I'm just here to deliver a message," he said. His voice was flat. No regional accent, the voice of a man from nowhere specific. "Then deliver it. Mr. Hale says the filing deadline for the Hendricks dispute is in 17 days. He says you should think carefully about what you plan to do before those 17 days are up." He held her gaze without any particular malice, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. This was work to him. Nothing more. "He says your father thought carefully about it too." "Eventually." Clara did not move, did not breathe differently, did not give him a single thing. "Tell Mr. Hale I'll give his message the consideration it deserves." She held the pistol steady at her side. "Close the door on your way out." He left. She heard his boots on the back steps unhurried. She stood without moving until the sound was gone entirely, and then she set the pistol on the desk and sat down and pressed both hands flat on the surface and looked at them until they stopped shaking. "Your father thought carefully about it too." "Eventually." She picked up her pen. Cole came back 40 minutes later and stopped when he saw her face. She told him what had happened without editorializing exactly as it had occurred in the order it had occurred. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was very still in the way that meant he was deciding something. "We leave tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow, tonight. The index, how much is left? 2 transfers. Finish them. I'll be back at sundown." He was already moving. "Pack only what you need for 3 days. Leave everything else exactly as it is. I want this office to look occupied when Hale's man comes back to check. Ruth. I'll tell Ruth on my way out. She'll know what to do with the copies if we don't make it back." He stopped at the door and turned back and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the recalibrating look, not the focused assessment. It was something more direct than that. Something that acknowledged without stating it that the situation had crossed from difficult into dangerous, and that crossing mattered to him in a way that went beyond the professional. "Clara, are you all right?" She thought about answering the way she had been answering every question for 2 weeks, steadily, efficiently, with the levelness her father had given her. Instead, she said, "He threatened my father with the same words before my father died. I understand what this is now." "Yes," Cole said. "I know you do. I'm not leaving those documents behind, and I'm not taking the settlement, and I'm not letting 17 days run out while Hale decides what to do next." She met his eyes directly. "So the answer to your question is, I'll be all right when this is finished." Cole looked at her for a moment that was neither long nor short, but had a particular quality to it, the quality of 2 people on opposite sides of a distance that is not yet crossed, seeing each other clearly for perhaps the first time. Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked out. She finished the index in 2 hours. When she was done, she read it through, twice corrected, 1 transposition error in the notarization exhibit numbers, and sat back and looked at what her father had spent the last months of his life trying to build, and what she had spent 2 weeks completing. 53 pages, 15 fraudulent transfers, 9 forged notarizations, 2 witness affidavits, 1 original survey record collection covering 12 years of honest work by a man who had taught her that numbers did not lie if you knew how to read them. She wrapped the exhibit in 2 layers of oilcloth and tied it with cord and wrote her name and the date on the outer wrapping in her clearest hand. She thought about Douglas Hale standing at her father's graveside with his hat in his hands. She thought about Warren teaching her long division at a kitchen table when she was 9 years old, his patience with her mistakes, his genuine pleasure when she got something right. She thought about Thomas Bellamy, showing Cole a scar on his forearm, and Jan Kowalski rebuilding from nothing in Battle Mountain, and Pete Dunbar's widow coming into this office confused about paperwork she had no memory of signing. She thought about the red-haired man's flat voice. Your father thought carefully about it too. Eventually. Not eventually, Clara said aloud to the empty office, to the fireproof cabinet, to the 53 pages wrapped in oilcloth on the corner of the desk. Now. She put her father's pistol in her traveling bag and waited for Cole Maddox to come back with the horses. They left Redstone Creek at 10 minutes past 9 in the evening, riding out through the livery stable's back gate on 2 horses Cole had arranged through a rancher named Pruitt, who owed him a favor and asked no questions. The night was cold and clear, the kind of Nevada cold that had no sympathy in it, and Clara rode with the oilcloth package strapped across her back under her coat, and her father's pistol in her saddlebag, and her eyes forward on the dark road. Cole rode slightly ahead and slightly to her left, which she understood was a positioning choice rather than a habit. It kept her on his gun side and left the open terrain to her right where he could see it. She had noticed in the past week that Cole Maddox made very few thoughtless decisions. Nearly everything he did had a reason underneath it, and the reason was usually about keeping the people around him safer than they would otherwise be. She thought her father would have liked him. She kept that thought brief because it led somewhere she couldn't afford to go on a dark road 60 miles from Carson City. They rode in silence for the first hour. The road climbed steadily out of the valley, and the wind came down off the ridgelines with a persistence that made conversation an effort. Clara did not mind the silence. She used it to go over the exhibit index in her head, cross-checking her own work the way her father had taught her. Start at the end and work backward, because errors hide in the places where your attention is already satisfied. Everything held. Around 11 o'clock, Cole pulled his horse alongside hers and said, "There's a relay station about 8 miles ahead. Friend of mine runs it. We can stop there for a few hours, rest the horses, get something hot to eat." "Is it safe to stop?" "Safer than riding blind through the pass at 2 in the morning." He glanced across at her. "Hale's men would have checked your office by now, found it empty. They'll assume Carson City, which means they'll take the main road at first light." He paused. "We're not on the main road." She looked at the terrain around them, the suggestion of hills and scrub in the moonlight, the absence of any track she could have named. "How long have you been planning the back route?" "Since the day I noticed the man in the brown coat." Clara absorbed that. "You were planning to get me out before I asked you to." "I was planning in case it was needed." He kept his eyes on the path ahead. "You always had the option to take the settlement and leave. I wasn't going to push you either direction." "But you thought I wouldn't take it." A pause. "I thought you were your father's daughter." And Edmund Ashworth was not a man who walked away from things that needed doing. He said it simply without making it more than it was, and it landed somewhere in Clara's chest, with a weight that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but contained something of both. She didn't answer. There was nothing to add. The relay station was a low building set back from the road with a corral on the east side and a lamp burning in the single window. The man who opened the door was called Henry Briggs, 60 years old, and built like a man who had spent those years doing something with his hands that was never quite finished. He looked at Cole with the brief expressionless acknowledgement of an old familiarity, and then looked at Clara with the particular attention of someone reassessing a situation. "This is Edmund Ashworth's daughter," Cole said. "We need 4 hours and something hot." Henry stepped back from the door. "Come in then." Inside, while Henry put a pot on, and Cole settled the horses, Clara sat at the plain table and allowed herself the first genuine stillness she had experienced since leaving Redstone Creek. The relay station smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the particular mineral scent of Nevada high desert that she had been breathing for 3 weeks without registering it. She took her coat off, carefully unwrapped the oilcloth package, and checked the documents by lamplight. All present. Nothing shifted in transit. She rewrapped them and tied the cord and kept the package on the table where she could see it. Henry set coffee and a bowl of something substantial in front of her without commentary, and she ate, because she had learned from Ruth that eating when food was available was a form of discipline, not a luxury. Cole came in from the corral and sat across from her, and Henry brought him the same without being asked. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had established enough mutual understanding that filling it was unnecessary. "Henry," Cole said when he finished, "has anyone come through tonight on the main road asking about a woman traveling toward Carson City?" Henry refilled his own cup and sat down at the end of the table. "Nobody tonight. Yesterday afternoon, though, a man came through asking about the Carson City road conditions. Said he was a courier." He looked at Cole steadily. "He was not a courier. Red hair scar on the jaw. Brown-haired fellow. Well-dressed for a courier. Asked particular questions about how fast a person could make the run if they were motivated." Henry's eyes moved to Clara briefly. "I told him the road was in poor condition after the spring runoff. Gave him some bad information about a washed-out section that doesn't exist." "He'll find out it doesn't exist," Cole said. "Sure, but it'll cost him 3 hours." Henry picked up his cup. "Edmund Ashworth notarized my water rights agreement 7 years ago. Charged me half rate because I couldn't cover the full fee that month and told me to pay the rest when I could. Never sent a collection notice." He looked at Clara directly. "I paid the rest 6 months later. He said he'd already forgotten about it. He had not. It was logged in his book, paid in full to the penny." He paused. "Whatever you're carrying, miss, I hope it does what you need it to." "It will," Clara said. They left before 3 in the morning, rested enough the horses watered and grained. The cold had deepened, and Clara rode with her coat buttoned to the throat, and her mind already past Carson City, already in the state land office, already standing in front of whatever clerk or administrator she was going to need to convince in the shortest possible time that 53 pages of documented fraud required immediate action. She had been rehearsing the conversation since Battle Mountain. She knew the Nevada Land Office filing procedures from her father's reference materials. She knew the specific statute under which fraudulent notarization of transfer documents constituted grounds for state-level review. She knew which sections of the exhibit to lead with, not the affidavits, which were compelling, but personal, but the notarization log discrepancies, which were mathematical and unarguable, and which any clerk with an hour of training could verify independently. Numbers did not lie if you knew how to read them. Numbers also did not lie if you knew how to present them. And Clara had spent 3 days thinking about nothing but presentation. Cole rode up beside her around 4 in the morning. She could not see his face clearly in the dark, but she had developed over the past week a reasonable ability to read his silences by their shape. This one had something in it. "Say what you're thinking," she told him. "I'm thinking about what happens after Carson City." He kept his voice level. "If the state land office accepts the complaint and initiates review, that's not the end of it. Hale will have legal representation in Carson City within a week. His lawyers will challenge the affidavits, challenge the notarization evidence, challenge your standing to file on behalf of the affected families. My father was the notarizing officer on 6 of the original contracts. His professional successor, which I am by his own written designation, has direct standing to challenge fraudulent use of his seal." She had worked this out 2 nights ago. The families themselves have standing on the transfer challenges. Bellamy and Kowalski have already committed to the process. Hale will go after them. He already did. They have scars to show for it. She paused. "Which is evidence of coercion, which strengthens the complaint." She heard Cole exhale something between acknowledgement and something harder to name. "You've been worried about the legal standing," she said. "You should have told me earlier." "I'm not a lawyer." "Neither am I. But my father was a notary and an accountant who worked alongside the county clerk's office for 12 years, and I read his professional reference library cover to cover, starting when I was 14. She kept her eyes on the dark road. "I know the argument Hale's lawyers will make. I've already addressed it in the exhibit. Section 4 of the index specifically documents the chain of professional succession and cites the relevant Nevada statute." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You wrote a legal brief. I wrote a supporting exhibit that anticipates and preempts the most likely challenges." She paused. "My father did this with his most complicated client cases. He called it building the roof before the storm. You don't wait to see what the other side argues. You address it first, and you address it in your own language, so the framing is already yours when they arrive." Another silence, longer this time. When Cole spoke, his voice had the particular quality she had heard in it occasionally over the past week, the quality that arrived when he was past the recalibration stage and into something more honest. "Your father taught you all of this." "He taught me the method. I applied it to this situation." She thought about Edmund Ashworth at a desk very much like the one she had been sitting at for 3 weeks, working through his client cases, with the same steady precision, the same refusal to leave a gap that an opponent could step into. "He was better at it than I am. He had 30 years of practice." A pause. "I have 17 days. They reached Carson City in the late morning, coming in from the south on a road that deposited them onto a back street 2 blocks from the state offices without passing through the main commercial district, where a well-dressed man asking questions about newly arrived travelers might be stationed. Cole had planned this too. Clara did not ask when. The Nevada State Land Office occupied the ground floor of a stone building on Musser Street with a facade that conveyed the state's official indifference to the urgency of private citizens. Clara walked in with the oilcloth package under her arm and approached the front counter with the particular posture her father had taught her for official interactions, straight-backed, direct, entirely certain of her right to be there, because certainty was the first thing a clerk assessed, and the first thing that determined whether they reached for the relevant form or told you to come back on Thursday. The clerk was a young man with spectacles and an expression trained to reveal nothing. "Can I help you, miss?" "I need to file a formal complaint under Nevada Revised Statute Section 47 fraudulent land transfer documentation affecting 15 separate claims in Redstone Creek, currently under the administration of Redstone Creek Land and Trust." She set the package on the counter and unwrapped it with efficient movements. "I have original survey records, certified copies of transfer documentation, a comparative analysis of assessed and transfer values across all 15 claims, evidence of fraudulent notarization in 9 of those transfers, and 2 sworn affidavits from former claim owners attesting to coercion at the point of transfer." The clerk looked at the stack of documents and then looked at Clara. This would need to go to the senior review officer." "I understand. I'd like to request that review today, given that the filing deadline for the Hendricks transfer dispute, which is one of the 15 claims documented here, is in 16 days. She slid the summary index across the counter. "This is the access guide for the exhibit. It's organized to make the review officer's assessment as efficient as possible." The clerk picked up the index. He read the first page. He turned to the second page. Something in his expression shifted from trained blankness to genuine attention, and Clara recognized that shift as the moment a person encountered numbers that were too clean to dismiss and too large to explain away. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared through the door behind him. Cole had come in behind her and was now standing slightly to her left and back, which she understood was a positioning choice. He did not interfere. He did not offer anything to the clerk or try to manage the interaction. He let her work, which she had come to understand over the past week was its own form of respect, more meaningful than assistance that substituted for her own capability. The senior review officer was a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Cross, which Clara had not expected and which settled something in her chest that had been held at a careful tension since she walked through the door. Adelaide Cross was 50 years old and wore no expression that Clara could read at all, which was exactly what a senior review officer should wear when presented with a formal complaint, and it meant she was doing her job rather than reacting to what she was looking at. She took the exhibit to a table and read for 40 minutes. Clara sat in the chair across from her and did not speak. Cole stood by the window. No one spoke. When Adelaide Cross looked up from the last page of the exhibit, she looked at Clara and said, "Who compiled this?" "I did. The original documentation was my father's. Edmund Ashworth, notary and certified public accountant, Redstone Creek, Nevada. He was the notarizing officer on 6 of the original contracts. He died 4 weeks ago. The letter in Appendix C is his, the one documenting his discovery of the notarization discrepancies. That's a copy of the letter he sent to a private inquiry office in Carson City 3 weeks before his death. The original is held by Cole Maddox, who is present." She did not gesture toward Cole. She kept her eyes on Adelaide Cross. "My father documented his concern for his own safety in that letter. He died 11 days before Mr. Maddox arrived in Redstone Creek to follow up." Adelaide Cross looked at Cole briefly and then back at Clara. "The 2 affidavits, Bellamy and Kowalski. Are these men reachable?" "I have current addresses for both. They've committed to participating in any state-level proceeding." Clara paused. "They left Redstone Creek under duress after their transfers. They were threatened by an individual employed outside Hale's official organization, a large red-haired man with a scar on his left jaw. Both men identified the same individual independently." Adelaide Cross set down the exhibit and folded her hands on the table. "Miss Ashworth, what you've brought me is one of the most thoroughly documented fraud complaints I have received in 11 years in this office." She said it without warmth, which made it more credible than warmth would have. It is also a complaint against one of the most influential private landholders in central Nevada, with access to significant legal resources and documented relationships with county-level officials in Redstone Creek. She paused. I want you to understand what initiating a state review means. It means Hale will know within days that this complaint has been filed. It means he will deploy legal representation to challenge every element of this exhibit. It means the affected families will be under pressure to recant their affidavits. I understand, Clara said. File it anyway. Adelaide Cross looked at her for a moment that reminded Clara of the moment Cole had first assessed her across her father's desk 2 seconds complete, arriving at something. I'll need you to remain in Carson City for at least 5 days while I process the initial review. If I find grounds to advance the complaint, and preliminary assessment suggests I'll need you available for the review hearing. We'll stay, Cole said from the window. It was the first thing he had said since entering the building. Adelaide Cross looked at him. Then she looked at Clara. Is there anyone in Redstone Creek who can be trusted to secure the original documents while you're here? Yes, Clara said. Her name is Ruth Hennessy. She has certified copies in a secured location. She knows to protect them. Good. Adelaide Cross picked up the exhibit and stood. I'll begin the preliminary review this afternoon. Come back tomorrow at 9 o'clock. She paused at the door and turned back. Your father's index system is very good. You improved it in 3 places. She went through the door before Clara could respond. The room was quiet. Clara looked at the table where the exhibit had been, and then looked at her own hands, and took a long breath for the first time in what felt like 4 days. Cole crossed the room and stood beside her. Not close, not crowding, just present the way he had learned to be present without making it about himself. She's going to advance it, Clara said. Yes, she is. Hale will know by the end of the week. Yes, he will. She turned and looked at Cole directly. He was watching her with the expression that was not recalibration anymore, and had not been recalibration for several days, if she was honest with herself, which she had not been until this moment, because there had been no room for it. The expression of a man who had stopped measuring a situation and started simply being in it. My father built that system for 30 years, and they destroyed it in 14 months, she said. And they thought that was the end of it. They didn't account for you, Cole said. Clara thought about Douglas Hale at the window of his bank watching the lamp burn in her father's office, not yet concerned. She thought about the red-haired man's flat voice and the way he had said eventually, like it was inevitable. She thought about Edmund Ashworth, alone in his office, the same desk she had been sitting at for 3 weeks writing a letter, because he had no other option, and sending it into the dark, hoping someone would come. Someone had come. Let's find somewhere to sleep, she said. We have a hearing in the morning. Cole touched the brim of his hat and moved toward the door, and Clara followed him out into the Carson City afternoon, with 53 pages now in Adelaide Cross's hands and 16 days left, and the absolute certainty settled and cold and precise, as a column of numbers that balanced perfectly, that Douglas Hale's 14 months of careful, profitable destruction was running out of time. Adelaide Cross advanced the complaint on the second morning. She called Clara and Cole into her office at 9 o'clock, precisely set the exhibit on the table between them, and said without preamble, I've completed preliminary review of all 53 pages. I'm initiating a formal state investigation into Redstone Creek Land and Trust under Nevada, revised Statute 47, and issuing an immediate freeze order on all pending transfer proceedings, including the Hendricks dispute. She looked at Clara over the top of her spectacles. The freeze order goes out this morning by telegraph to the Redstone Creek County Clerk's office and to the District Court in Carson City. Hale's legal team will have it by afternoon. Which means Hale himself will have it before that, Cole said. Yes. Adelaide Cross folded her hands. Miss Ashworth, I need to ask you directly. Is there anyone remaining in Redstone Creek who is in a position to be harmed in retaliation before the state investigator can arrive on site? I'm sending an investigator within 4 days, but 4 days is a window. Clara thought about Ruth Hennessy, with the certified copies under her floorboards. She thought about Pete Dunbar's widow, who had come into the office confused about paperwork. She thought about the 14 other families whose names were in the exhibit, some still in Redstone Creek, and some scattered across Nevada, all of them having made the calculation that silence was safer than speaking. Ruth Hennessy, she said. She has copies of the entire exhibit, and she knows what they are. If Hale figures out she has them, write her name and address. Adelaide Cross pushed a paper across the table. I'll include a protection notice in the telegraph to the district court. It won't have teeth until the investigator arrives, but it creates an official record that she's a material witness. That changes the calculation for anyone thinking about paying her a visit. Clara wrote Ruth's name and address in her clearest hand and slid the paper back. What about Warren Ashworth? Adelaide Cross's expression did not change. Your uncle is named in the exhibit as a knowing participant in the scheme. He will be served with a state inquiry notice, along with Hale and the trust officers. What he does with that notice is his own decision. She paused. I'm sorry. I understand he is your family. He made his choice, Clara said. I'm making mine. They left the state land office with a copy of the freeze order and a formal acknowledgement of complaint that Clara folded into the oilcloth wrapping with the same care she had given the original exhibit. The morning was bright and cold, and Carson City was conducting its business around them with the indifference of a city large enough not to notice two people standing on a stone step recalibrating the landscape of the past 4 weeks. Cole stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. Then, it's done. The filing is done, Clara said. It's not over. No, but the part that only you could do is done. She looked at the freeze order in her hands, the part that only she could do. Her father's system, her father's 12 years of careful documentation, her father's absolute insistence that numbers recorded honestly were the most durable form of truth available to a person operating in a world that preferred comfortable fictions. She had carried that forward. She had completed what he started, and she had done it before the window closed, and that was going to have to be enough for right now, because the rest of it, the grief, the full weight of the past 4 weeks, the thing she had been holding at a locked distance since the morning. Edmund Ashworth's hand went cold in hers, was still waiting, and she was not ready for it yet. We need to get back to Redstone Creek, she said, before Hale does something to Ruth. They rode back on the main road fast because speed mattered more than concealment now that the complaint was filed and the freeze order was moving through telegraph lines toward Redstone Creek. There was nothing left to hide. The documents were in Adelaide Cross's hands. The certified copies were in Ruth's strongbox, and Douglas Hale was going to know Clara Ashworth's name before sundown, whether she rode in through the front gate or the back. Cole pushed the pace and didn't apologize for it, and Clara kept up without being asked to, which she suspected he had already known she would. They came into Redstone Creek in the late afternoon of the following day, dusty and road-worn, and the first person Clara saw on Main Street was Ruth Hennessy, standing outside the boarding house with her arms crossed, and an expression that meant she had been waiting and was not particularly pleased about the waiting, but was relieved the waiting was over. Clara dismounted, and Ruth crossed the distance between them and did something Clara had not expected. She put both hands on Clara's face briefly, the way a woman does with someone she has decided belongs to her, and looked at her with the directness that was Ruth's particular form of affection. It's done. Filed and freeze order issued. State investigator arrives in 4 days. Good. Ruth dropped her hands and looked at Cole. There's been activity. Warren came to the boarding house yesterday afternoon asking if I'd seen you. I told him you'd gone to visit a friend in Elko, and I expected you back next week. He didn't believe me, but he left. She paused. Hale's man, the one with the brown coat, he's been replaced by 2 others. They're not pretending to browse the dry goods store anymore. They're just standing there. The freeze order went out this morning by telegraph, Cole said. Hale already knows. Then he'll move fast before the investigator gets here. Ruth looked between them. What do you need? The copies are still secure, Clara asked. Exactly where you left them. Keep them there. The state investigator will need them as backup verification. Clara looked up the street toward her father's office and then toward Hale's bank, where a lamp was burning in the upper window despite it being late afternoon. Has anyone been in the office? The lock was broken 2 nights ago. Ruth's voice was level, but her jaw was tight. I checked the next morning. Someone went through the filing cabinet. They were looking for something. I don't know if they found it. Clara felt something cold move through her that was not fear. It was closer to confirmation. She looked at Cole. The restricted files. The fraudulent transfer originals, which are in the exhibit in Adelaide Cross's office. Clara turned back to Ruth. They didn't find what they were looking for. The originals were already in Carson City. She started walking toward the office. Cole was beside her without needing to be asked. The filing cabinet had been opened with force, the lock mechanism bent. 3 of the client files were out of order. Someone had rifled through them with more urgency than precision. But the file that Hale's man had been sent to retrieve, the one containing the original transfer documents with their fraudulent notarization stamps, was 60 miles away and already entered into a state proceeding that would outlast anything Douglas Hale could do to a filing cabinet on Main Street in Redstone Creek, Nevada. Clara straightened the files with methodical care, each one returned to its proper place in her father's order. Cole watched from the doorway without commenting. When she finished, she closed the cabinet and looked at it for a moment, and then turned around and went to the desk and sat down and picked up the pen that was still sitting in its holder, exactly where she had left it. He broke the lock, she said. He's frightened, Cole said. Frightened men make noise. He killed my father. She said it plainly, looking at the desk surface. He had my father killed because my father found the truth and was going to expose it. And then he came to the funeral and shook my hand, and then he sent a man to this office to tell me my father thought carefully about it too. Eventually. She set the pen down. I want him to face what he did, not just the land fraud, what he did to Edmund Ashworth. The investigation will go where the evidence goes, Cole said carefully. The evidence goes there. She looked up at him. My father's letter documented his fear for his safety. The timing of his death 11 days before you arrived, 3 weeks after the letter that's in the exhibit. Adelaide Cross saw it. She didn't say she was ignoring it. She didn't say she was pursuing it either. She said the investigation will be thorough. Clara held Cole's gaze. She said preliminary assessment suggests she'll advance the full complaint. The full complaint includes Appendix C. She paused. I need you to tell me honestly whether that's enough. Cole crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, the client chair, Edmund Ashworth's client chair, where dozens of men and women had sat over 12 years to put their most important concerns into her father's careful hands. He sat in it and looked at Clara directly and said, It may be enough to open an inquiry into your father's death. It may not be enough to prove what Hale ordered. Those are different things. I know. A conviction for fraud and a conviction for what happened to your father require different levels of evidence. The fraud case is documented to a standard that's very hard to challenge. The other. I know, she said again. I know the difference. She looked at the desk. But he will answer for the fraud. He will answer for the 15 families. The investigator will arrive, and the freeze order will hold, and the state will see what my father spent his last months documenting. That's real. That's not nothing. That's everything, Cole said. That's what your father died trying to accomplish. The silence between them had a different quality than the silences of the past 2 weeks. Those had been working silences, purposeful, charged with the urgency of what needed to be done next. This one was the silence of something completed, and it was wider and more exposed and considerably more difficult to sit inside. I'm going to go see Ruth, Clara said. I need to tell her what happens next. She stood and paused, looking at Cole still sitting in the client chair. "Thank you. For Winnemucca. For Battle Mountain. For the back road and Henry Briggs, and not trying to manage the filing yourself." She met his eyes. "For letting me do my own work." Something moved in Cole's expression that she had no immediate name for. "Your father sent a letter into the dark, hoping someone would come," he said. "I came. You did everything else." She left him there and walked to Ruth's boarding house in the early evening and sat at Ruth's kitchen table and accepted coffee and told her everything from the freeze order to Adelaide Cross to the broken filing cabinet in the complete and sequential way she had been taught to report important information. No omissions, no softening facts in the order. They occurred with their implications stated plainly. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Ruth refilled both cups and sat back and said, "Your father would be proud of you." The thing in Clara's chest, the one she had been holding at a locked distance for 4 weeks, pressed outward with a force she could no longer manage, and this time, she did not try. She pressed her hand flat on Ruth's kitchen table and looked at the lamp and let herself feel the full shape of it. The loss of Edmund Ashworth. The 12 years of careful work. The letter sent into the dark. The 47 documents and the 9 missing log entries and the 15 families and the red-haired man's voice saying eventually, like it was inevitable. All of it. The whole weight of 4 weeks and 19 years of being Edmund Ashworth's daughter, and the particular solitude of being the only person who could see what he had left her to find. She did not cry. It was not that kind of release. It was more like something that had been held under pressure, being allowed to exist at its full size for the first time, and existing at its full size meant she could also feel alongside the grief. The other things, the completeness of the work she had done, the knowledge that the exhibit was in Adelaide Cross's hands, and the freeze order was moving, and the state investigator was coming, and Hale's men could stand in the street as long as they wanted, because there was nothing left in this office that they could take. Ruth put her hand over Clara's and said nothing, which was exactly right. Douglas Hale came to the office the following morning himself. No intermediary, no Warren, no men positioned on the boardwalk. He came alone, and he knocked correctly, and when Clara opened the door, he was wearing his funeral expression, the practiced sympathy she had seen at her father's graveside. And she thought about everything that expression had been covering for the past 4 weeks, and stood aside to let him in, because she wanted to hear what a man said when he had run out of moves. Cole was in the back room. She had not told him to stay there. He had positioned himself there before Hale arrived, which meant he had anticipated this visit and made a choice about how to handle it. She noted it and left him to his choice. Hale sat down across from her desk without being invited, which was different from the way Cole had done the same thing on the first night, and the difference was everything. He looked at her with the full weight of his authority and said, "I want you to understand that what I've built in this county has employed 300 men, 300 families. The trust has funded the school, the hospital, the road to the northern claims. What you've done filing this complaint, initiating this investigation, will damage something that serves this entire community." Clara looked at him. "Thomas Bellamy has a scar on his forearm," she said. "Jan Kowalski rebuilt from nothing in Battle Mountain. Pete Dunbar's widow came into my father's office confused about paperwork. She had no memory of signing. Margaret Hendricks is still fighting for a claim your trust took from her for $60 when my father assessed it at $9,000. She kept her voice entirely level. "Those are your 300 families, Mr. Hale, the ones you built this on." Hale's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Your father was a good man who made the mistake of not understanding the larger picture. My father understood the picture perfectly." She put her hands flat on the desk. "That's why you had him killed." The room was very still. "Be quiet." Hale looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read and had no interest in reading. Then he stood and adjusted his coat and said, "The state investigation will find what it finds. My legal representation will be present at every stage." He moved toward the door. I hope for your sake that you've been as thorough as you believe you have, Miss Ashworth. Because if there is a single error in that exhibit, my attorneys will find it and use it." "There are no errors," Clara said. "I built the roof before the storm." He left. She heard his footsteps on the boardwalk, unhurried the footsteps of a man who had not yet accepted what was happening to him. She sat behind her father's desk in the office Edmund Ashworth had built over 12 years of honest work, and she let Douglas Hale's footsteps fade into the sounds of Main Street, and then she picked up her pen. Cole came out of the back room and stood in the doorway without speaking. She wrote for a moment, finishing the notation she had started before Hale arrived, and then set the pen down and looked up. "He'll fight it," she said. "Yes. His lawyers will challenge the affidavits and the notarization evidence and my standing to file and anything else they can reach." "Yes," Cole said. "And the exhibit answers every one of those challenges because you put the roof up before the storm." He crossed the room and stood on the other side of the desk and looked at her with the expression she had finally named 2 days ago in Carson City. The expression of a man who was no longer in a professional situation and had not been for some time and had been waiting for the right moment to say so. "Hale knows it too. That's why he came himself. He came to see if you'd flinch." "I didn't flinch." "No, you did not." She looked at him across her father's desk, across the exhibit copies, and the client ledger, and the notarization log with its 9 missing entries, and she thought about the night 4 weeks ago, when Cole Maddox had walked through an unlocked door, and she had stood up with a pistol and demanded to know who he was. She thought about Winnemucca, and Battle Mountain, and Henry Briggs's relay station, and the back road into Carson City and Adelaide Cross, reading 53 pages for 40 minutes in complete silence. She thought about the distance between two people that starts as professional and becomes something else so gradually that you cannot point to the moment it changed. The state investigator arrived 4 days later, a precise gray-haired man named Arthur Vance, who read the exhibit in 3 hours, interviewed Clara for 90 minutes, requested Cole's full account in writing, and sent a telegraph to Carson City at the end of the first day that resulted in Douglas Hale being formally notified of a state fraud investigation with potential criminal referral. Warren Ashworth received his notice the same afternoon. Clara heard he was on a stage to California within 24 hours, and felt about that something quieter and more complicated than satisfaction, the feeling of a door closing on a room she would not enter again. The freeze order held. The Hendricks dispute was preserved. Thomas Bellamy gave his affidavit to Vance by telegraph from Winnemucca. Jan Kowalski rode in from Battle Mountain himself, arriving unannounced at the state investigator's temporary office on the second day, with his wife's testimony written out in her own hand alongside his own. And when Clara heard about it, she sat down for a moment because her father had gone to Jan Kowalski personally to apologize, and Kowalski had come back personally to make sure Edmund Ashworth's work counted for something. It counted. Arthur Vance submitted his preliminary findings to the State Land Office at the end of the first week, and the findings supported every element of the complaint. 9 fraudulent notarizations confirmed. 15 below-value transfers recommended for reversal. 2 cases referred to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation, including one that involved the circumstances of Edmund Ashworth's death. Clara was alone in the office when Vance told her about the criminal referral. She thanked him and waited until he left, and then sat at her father's desk for a long time without moving. It was not the ending of anything. It was the beginning of a process that would take months and might not produce the outcome she wanted, and might not give Edmund Ashworth the full accounting his death deserved. She knew that. She was her father's daughter, and her father had been a man who did not mistake the start of a process for its conclusion. But the referral existed. The complaint was on record. The 15 families had their freeze order and their reverse transfer recommendations, and 2 of them had already written to the office asking whether they could reopen their claims. The truth that her father had died documenting was now in the hands of the state of Nevada, and it was not going away. She picked up the photograph from the desk drawer and set it in front of her and looked at Edmund Ashworth's precise, patient face and said, "It's in the record, Papa. All of it. Everything you found, everything you built, everything you were afraid they would bury with you. She pressed her hand flat on the desk one more time, feeling the solidity of it. 12 years of her father's work in the wood, and the files, and the careful system she had learned and used, and carried 60 miles through the dark. They didn't bury it. Cole found her there an hour later. He came through the front door this time, which meant he was not in operational mode anymore, but simply arriving, and he sat in the client chair across from her desk with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the expression that had no professional distance left in it whatsoever. "Vance is satisfied with the submission," he said. "He told me your exhibit is the cleanest fraud documentation he's seen in 20 years of state investigation work. My father built the system. You used it to do something he couldn't finish." Cole turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I need to tell you something." "Then tell me." "I have been a private investigator for 2 years. Before that, I was a deputy for 6 years. I have worked with a lot of people in situations that required someone to hold their nerve under pressure and keep thinking clearly when everything around them was designed to make clear thinking impossible." He held her gaze. "I have never worked with anyone who did it better than you did." Clara looked at him across the desk, across the space that had been a working distance and a professional boundary, and a cautious acknowledgement of mutual respect that had been quietly becoming something else for 4 weeks and was now simply what it was. "You came when my father sent a letter into the dark," she said. "I want you to know that I understand what that means. He was alone, and he was afraid, and he didn't know if anyone would come, and you came." "I came for the assignment," Cole said. "I stayed for—" He stopped. The quiet between them had the particular quality of something that did not need to be finished to be understood. "I stayed," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "I'm going to keep the office open. Keep the practice running. My father's clients need someone, and the town needs someone who isn't in Douglas Hale's pocket." She paused. "That's going to take time to build. Years, probably." "I know," Cole said. "I'm not leaving Redstone Creek." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going back to Carson City?" Cole set his hat on the corner of the desk, a deliberate movement, unhurried the movement of a man putting something down in a place he intends to return to. "My assignment is concluded," he said. "What I do after a concluded assignment is my own business." "Then I'm asking," Clara said, "as my own business. Are you going back?" "No," Cole Maddox said. "I don't believe I am." Outside on Main Street, Redstone Creek went about the ordinary business of a town that did not yet fully understand what had changed within it. The powerful man in the bank, with the lamp burning in his upper window, now facing the weight of a state investigation that had been built from his own crimes, documented in the clean, precise language of numbers that did not lie, by a 19-year-old woman sitting in her dead father's chair, who had inherited not his vulnerability, but his most formidable weapon. Inside the office, Edmund Ashworth had built over 12 years of honest work. Clara Ashworth opened her father's notarization log to a clean page and entered the date at the top in her clearest hand, and the record that Douglas Hale had spent 14 months trying to corrupt and bury and erase continued forward unbroken, exactly as it should.